All right, hello everybody and welcome back to the last lecture for week 7. All right, so this is actually going to be the first lecture for the respiratory system. We have officially concluded the cardiovascular system. But before we go too far, I wanted to remind you all of the components that make up the cardiovascular system that we've been talking about for the last 5 lectures, which includes the heart, the vasculature, and the blood. But it also includes the lungs, which we have spoken a lot about as far as the circulatory system goes. And now we are finally getting into the nitty-gritty of exactly what the lungs do. All right, so I also wanted to give you a quick refresher of why we have lungs. So the early first animals that eventually became land animals had to develop lungs in order to survive in the open air instead of the water. So water has, as I've mentioned, water animals have single circulation. All right, so they have gills where they can immediately extract oxygen and have some gas exchange that occurs directly at the site of the gills that can go directly to and from the heart and the rest of the body systems. When we got out onto land, however, we did not have that capacity. So lungs developed in order that we would be able to extract oxygen and exchange gases with the air instead of the water. All right, so lungs are an essential component of circulation. They make up the pulmonary circuit. That is where we get rid of CO2 and take on oxygen in order that oxygenated blood can circulate through the rest of the system. All right, so lungs are extremely important for gas exchange. So what makes up the respiratory system? Today, I'm just going to give mostly an introduction to the structures and the physiological zones. And in the next several lectures, I'll be going over pulmonary ventilation and respiratory gas exchange. So one of the major main components of respiration that I want you all to understand is that it takes on 2 different forms, bulk flow versus diffusion. All right, so bulk flow is the movement of molecules from high pressure areas to low pressure areas. So when we think about the whole respiratory system, this mechanism, bulk flow, is utilized at 2 major areas. First, in the lungs, when we move air in and out of the lungs by bulk flow. So that is a huge intake of breath and expiration of breath. The second area where this occurs is in the body. So we, as I mentioned, take in oxygen so that oxygenated blood can flow around through the rest of the body tissues. All right, so that is depicted here at site 3 in this diagram here. So I've put the numbers here to orient you. At the lung, we have bulk flow where gases are moved into the lungs, and we have bulk flow at the level of the body where dissolved gases are flowing through the systemic circulatory system. Diffusion, on the other hand, is an automatic flow of molecules from areas of high concentration to low concentration. So this occurs again at the lung, where we actually have the loading of oxygen into the blood and offloading of carbon dioxide. All right, so this happens by diffusion, the actual action of loading and unloading of oxygen and carbon dioxide molecules. This also happens at the site of the capillaries. So we have onloading of carbon dioxide, offloading of oxygen, so that the tissues can utilize that oxygen for energy. So there's another way to think about the different sites where gas exchange occurs. All right, so when we're talking about diffusion, there's actually 2 different types where diffusion is utilized, and we refer to this as external and internal respiration. All right, so external respiration occurs at the lungs, which I mentioned, which was, I believe, site 2 on the prior diagram. So oxygen is loaded into the blood, carbon dioxide is offloaded. This is where capillaries, pulmonary capillaries, are right against the alveoli, which I will mention in the next couple slides, These are the air sacs that contain the air that you have just taken into your lungs, and then you can expel the CO2 that's offloaded. Whereas internal respiration happens within the body's tissues. So this is the capillary beds that are in your extremities, all around the internal systemic circulation. This is where oxygen is unloaded from the blood and carbon dioxide is loaded into the blood so that these tissue cells can take in the oxygen for energy. They can offload the CO2 that they've expelled through energy utilization, and that CO2 can then circulate back to the lungs to be expelled. All right, so external respiration, diffusion at the site of the lungs. Internal respiration, diffusion of gases at the site of the tissues, systemic diffusion. So there are two different zones that the respiratory system is broken into. And this is restricted to the lungs themselves, all right? So you have a right and a left lung. When you take in air, you're taking that in at the conducting zone. This is the trachea, the bronchial tree, the bronchioles, and the terminal bronchioles. So when you intake air, that goes down your trachea and then splits to the right and the left bronchial trees, then continues to branch down. These are just rigid conduits for conducting air flow. So that's why they're called, this is part of the conducting zone. There's no gas exchange at these levels. There's only gas exchange at the respiratory zone. Okay, so think of the conducting zone as just for conducting air. The respiratory zone is actually where respiration occurs, where you have that gas exchange. So this is at the respiratory bronchioles and the alveolar sacs. So what are the structures of the conducting zone? So again, just as a reminder, these are the rigid conduits. They conduct air flow, but there's no gas exchange at these particular sites. So this begins at your nose or mouth and your nasal cavity, all right? So any mammal, human or otherwise, is going to be breathing in air through the nose or the mouth, and that enters the nasal cavity, their oral cavity, where it is warmed. In the case of the nose and the nasal cavity, it's filtered, and then that warmth and moisture in those areas humidifies the air. Then that air goes down to the pharynx. So again, this is not pictured in the diagram here, but I want you to understand that the pharynx is pretty much just a region that is back behind your nasal cavity and behind your oral cavity, behind your laryngeal area, where the this pharynx can be broken down into three specific regions: the nasopharynx behind your nasal cavity, the oropharynx behind your oral cavity, and the laryngopharynx behind the larynx. All right, so this is similarly allows air to be conducted down this area, continues to warm and humidify. Then we hit the trachea. All right, so the trachea is the first thing other than the larynx, which is our voice box, that is pictured here in this diagram. So the trachea is going to have, and also certain other bronchus and bronchioles down here are going to have cartilage that ring these areas in order to keep the windpipes rigid, relatively flexible, but still rigid, so that when there's low pressure, they don't just collapse. All right, so there's a little bit of wiggle room, but mostly they're flexible rigidity within these cartilage rings that allows air to flow from high to low pressure. When there's low pressure, that tube would normally collapse, but the cartilage rings prevent that from collapsing. So we then, from the trachea, branch out into the main bronchus or primary bronchus on the right and the left sides. Then we have collectively termed the bronchial tree. So that would sort of encompass pretty much all of these secondary, tertiary, quaternary branches that are down here, okay? And there are a lot of these. So mostly what I want you to understand is that we go from trachea to bronchus to bronchial tree, which contains bronchioles, and then terminal bronchioles. There are about 60,000 branches in the average human lung of these bronchioles. Okay, so once we get to the terminary bronchioles, we've reached the respiratory zone. All right, so terminary bronchioles terminate here. Then we reach the respiratory bronchioles here, which ultimately lead into the alveolar ducts. And then the alveolar ducts lead into collectively what is the cluster of alveoli, which is termed the alveolar sac. Okay, so you can see the cross section down here where the alveolar duct terminates, and you have different alveoli, which are hollow sacs, which is their only purpose is to contain gases. All right, so the air we breathe in, that is contained and exchanged at the site of these alveolar sacs. So air comes down all the way down the conducting zone and then into the respiratory zone where it is contained in these alveoli, and that allows for the actual gas exchange at these sites. So alveoli, importantly, are surrounded by capillaries. So remember on a few slides ago where I told you about internal versus external respiration, these capillary zones here at the site of the lungs, at the alveolar sacs, are the sites of external respiration. This is where external gases, so the air we breathe in, is exchanged for the gases that our blood has just brought into the lungs. All right, so that's it for the introduction here. What I want you to know is the difference between bulk flow and diffusion, which are the two ways that gases are moved through our bodies. I want you to also know the difference between external and internal respiration. And I want you to know the physiological zones, the conducting and the respiratory zones. Please come to class on Monday. This will be October 11th with any questions that you might have, anything that wasn't clear. And I'll see you then.